honored to be chairing the Milwaukee Jewish Federation's 2024 Edie Adelman Political Awareness Lecture, along with Sharon Grinker, Jill Plavnik, Carrie Steinberger, Jill, Carrie, and I are thrilled to be here with all of you. Sharon, unfortunately, could not join us tonight. This annual Women's Philanthropy Lecture was the brainchild of Edie Adelman, of blessed memory, one of our Milwaukee Jewish community's most influential leaders. Edie had a bold vision: empower women by making political educational opportunities available to them. In order to make her dream a reality, Edie established an endowment to fund programming during her lifetime and beyond. The event eventually was opened up to the entire Jewish community, as well as the general public. To date, this amazing lecture series has covered an array of issues, including Israel, hunger, voting rights, Holocaust education, domestic violence and human trafficking, mental health, and more.
After discussions with community members this past year, we originally had planned for the 2024 Edie Adelman Lecture to address democracy. But after October 7th, we felt it was imperative to acknowledge the extremely concerning increase in anti-Semitism we are seeing. With the help of Federation's Jewish Community Relations Council, more regarding the JCRC shortly, we were able to combine the topics of democracy and anti-Semitism thanks to today's guest speaker, Amy Spitalnik, CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, or the JCPA. The JCPA strengthens and leverages the Jewish Community Relations Network across the United States to champion a just, democratic, and pluralistic society. It advances the right of full inclusion for all members of our society. JCPA is often on the front lines of countering anti-Semitism and preserving democracy. The Milwaukee Jewish community has its own JCPA, the Jewish Community Relations Council. Founded in 1938, JCRC advocates for the rights and values of Jews individually and collectively, here and abroad. JCRC implements a coordinated program of education, action, and advocacy for the Jewish community. I was inspired to join the JCRC board a few years ago by my fellow Women's Philanthropy board friends. Now, as a member of both boards, I am grateful that I have the opportunity to work on this event and bring both of my passions together. I have learned more and more about the important impact that our JCRC makes. I am thrilled to know that the JCPA is one of Milwaukee JCRC's most committed partners in the fight for democracy and against anti-Semitism.
As a board member of both Women's Philanthropy and JCRC, the intersection of the two is quite apparent to me, especially as women are increasingly occupying and leading in the political arena. The JCRC speaks as a representative of the Jewish community on issues of public affairs and public policy by convening and mobilizing the Jewish community. Women's Philanthropy creates community leaders and philanthropists. So pairing these two Federation functions to create this program in context made a lot of sense. We are fortunate to have the support of women like Amy Spitalnik and Ann Jacobs, tonight's moderator, my fellow co-chairs, and other Federation women leaders who care deeply about fighting anti-Semitism and preserving democracy and are making their voices heard in the public discourse. As JCRC's anti-Semitism audit chair for the last 4 years, I've watched anti-Semitism increase throughout our community and our country. Through the audit, we also have learned that as hatred expressed towards Jews has increased, it has also increased towards other targeted groups. At the same time, we are all seeing challenges to our democracy on the state and federal levels. Although fighting anti-Semitism and safeguarding our democracy are two different issues, they are connected in ways that are not always obvious. I'm so glad that Amy Spitalnik is here with us tonight to make sense of how the topics are intertwined. Now it's my honor to welcome Joan Lubar, Board Chair of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, to talk more about the impact of anti-Semitism in Milwaukee and how the Federation is addressing it.
Good evening. As Jill said, I'm Joan Lubar, the board chair of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. According to JCRC's 2022 audit of anti-Semitic incidents, hate group activity increased 83% from 2021 to 2022, while incidents increased 225% on college campuses and 22% at K-12 schools. Overall, anti-Semitism has increased 494% since 2015. That's 7 consecutive years of elevated activity. And these are the reported numbers before October 7th, which we'll address shortly. This is simply horrendous. We are working every single day to combat hatred. JCRC has been partnering directly with parents, schools, leaders, and institutions in response to anti-Semitic incidents. It has brought ADL programs for Jewish youth to Milwaukee and steadily increased the number of organizations and students who benefit from these programs. The Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center and Jewish Museum Milwaukee, both Federation programs, have educated tens of thousands of students and other community members on who the Jewish people are and the lessons of the Holocaust. Additionally, Federation and its government affairs partner, the Wisconsin Jewish Conference, have continued their relationship building and engagement in government affairs, focusing on defending Jewish people both individually and collectively. JCRC is now preparing the 2023 audit of anti-Semitic incidents, which will review and assess anti-Semitic activity in 2023. The audit report will be released in April, and I strongly encourage you to read it. We anticipate this year's numbers will be even more troubling than the year before, as we have seen a spike since October 7th, of which we are all keenly aware. When October 7th happened, Federation, fortunately, was fully prepared to set up an Israel Emergency Fund and related initiatives. To date, we have raised more than $5.2 million in support, created community solidarity programs, and increased security for all Jewish organizations throughout the entire state of Wisconsin. We also began fighting anti-Semitism on a whole new level. This has involved scaling up our existing efforts while implementing additional strategies, such as connecting with friends and allies of the Jewish community to help them better understand how the October 7th attacks have impacted our community. Guiding local school districts on how to support Jewish students and families. Plugging into our national network of experts on anti-Semitism and community relations to help share best practices with our local Jewish institutions, and engaging elected officials in our Israel solidarity efforts. All of this incredible work could not be possible without our amazing Federation staff. I now want to acknowledge and say thank you to Milwaukee Jewish Federation's JCRC team. First, Andrea Bernstein. She's our JCRC Associate Director. I want to thank you for your dedication and tireless work on everything that I have just mentioned. We are indebted to you for helping to safeguard our Jewish community during this extremely difficult time. To bolster Andrea and JCRC's efforts, new staff members will soon be joining the JCRC team. I'm thrilled to announce that Roberta Clark will step into the role of JCRC Director later this spring. And additionally, I'm pleased to welcome Shai Wise as the new JCRC Associate Director for Programs and Alliances. Roberta and Shai are and will be working with Andrea on the 2023 audit that I referenced earlier. Thank you all. We look forward to the impact you will have in Milwaukee and beyond through the JCRC. And now it is my pleasure to hand the mic to my friend and neighbor, Tanya Arbit, our Women's Philanthropy Chair, to introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I'm Tanya Arbit, Chair of the Women's Philanthropy. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to first acknowledge Maharat Ori Pikernis, who is the Senior Vice President for Community Relations for the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. She has been traveling and working closely with our guest speaker today. Thank you for being here with us in Milwaukee tonight. Now it is an honor to introduce our guest speaker, Amy Spitalnik, CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Amy previously served as Executive Director of Integrity First for America, IFA, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate group responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Under Amy's leadership, IFA became a powerful national voice in the fight against white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and extremism, and its Charlottesville case has emerged as a model for accountability. Amy also serves as a senior advisor for extremism to Human Rights First on the advisory board of the Polarization and Extremist Research and Innovation Lab, Pearl, at American University, and on the Drugs National Leadership Council. She has extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as a communication director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General and spokesperson and advisor to the New York City Mayor. She has also worked with several federal, state, and local officials, campaigns, and advocacy organizations, including as a J Street's first press secretary. Amy will be joined by Ann Jacobs, a JCRC board member and the founder of Jacobs Injury Law in Milwaukee. Ann will moderate a discussion on tonight's topic. So let me introduce Ann. Ann Jacobs is a trial attorney in private practice, advocating to the rights of the injured. Ann honed her legal skills as a public defender, becoming an experienced courtroom advocate, defending clients in cases ranging from juvenile offense to murders. After a decade of service to the Wisconsin Association of Justice, WAJ, as a member of the board of directors, Ann was elected president. In recognition of her skills as well as her service to WAJ and trial bar, Ann was honored as a Trial Lawyer of the Year in 2018. She has also been recognized as a super lawyer by her peers and has been listed as one of the top 50 lawyers in Wisconsin. She has been named to the best lawyers in America, and her firm has been honored as the best law firm in America. In 2016, Ann began a distinguished tenure in public service as a member of the Wisconsin Election Commission, where she served as a vice chair and chair. Along with fellow commissioner and staff, Ann has guided Wisconsin through multiple election cycles, ensuring secure elections and protecting the right to vote even during once-in-a-century pandemic. Ann serves as a member of the board of the director of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation and previously served as the chair of the Jewish Community Council. Now please join me in welcoming to the stage our very special guests, Amy Spitalnik and Ann Jacobs.
I am so excited to see so many people here tonight. This is just terrific. Amy, I am just delighted that you're able to join us here in Milwaukee, and I'm excited for tonight's conversation.
So glad to be here.
So I want to start by pulling out of Tanya's introduction of you something that's very interesting to me, and that was your work regarding what happened in Charlottesville. Can you start by telling us a little bit about that part of your history?
Yeah. You know, I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and if you had told me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that we would be grappling with the resurgent anti-Semitism and broader hate and extremism we're seeing in this country, I might have thought you were crazy. And certainly if you had told me that my career would be focused on taking on neo-Nazis, on fighting anti-Semitism through a national Jewish organization, I might have really thought you were crazy. But that is really where we're at. And so when I was serving in the New York Attorney General's office and the opportunity came up to work with some fantastic, incredible lawyers to hold accountable the extremists responsible for what happened in Charlottesville 6.5 years ago, I don't know how anyone could say no to that, let alone me personally as the granddaughter of survivors and as someone who really thought that we were past that in this society and clearly was wrong. I think many of us thought that we were here in this country, the country that my grandparents came to in search of a safer, better life for their family, and thought that, what the blood and soil, the Jews will not replace us, the swastikas, was largely relegated to the shadows, to the corners. But in the last 6-7 years, they've been emboldened in ways none of us could have expected. And that requires us to confront it head on, and that's what this work was about. We, in partnership with this incredible legal team and on behalf of 9 Charlottesville community members who were injured in that violence, brought a civil lawsuit against 24 neo-Nazis and white supremacists most directly responsible for orchestrating that violence. In social media posts on sites like Discord, sites that some of us might use or that our kids and grandkids might use, they planned every detail of this violence down to discussions of what to wear and what to bring to lunch, and whether they could hit protesters with cars and claim self-defense, which is of course ultimately what they did as part of that horrific weekend of violence. We remember those images of the tiki torches, of the chants of Jews will not replace us, of the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured so many others. And what's become clear since is that that violence first was no accident, it was planned as I described, and that what happened in Charlottesville that weekend wasn't an isolated incident, but really a harbinger of the broader extremism and hate that we've seen across this country in recent years. From Pittsburgh, the deadliest attack on the Jewish community on American soil, to Buffalo and El Paso and Poway and Jacksonville, and obviously not far from here in Oak Creek, predating Charlottesville, but driven by the very same white supremacist bigotry and hate. And now, post-October 7th, we are seeing this, it could really feel like that anti-Semitism is coming from all directions, that hate and extremism is coming from all directions, because in many ways it is. I think we knew how this bigotry was being normalized on the right in the form of these conspiracy theories, this idea of Jews not replacing us, of the great replacement of QAnon, of rhetoric from certain politicians and pundits that was increasingly mainstreamed. And as we're now seeing, as it relates to Israel and some of the very same conspiracy theories related to Jewish control and power, it's becoming increasingly normalized in other spaces on the left and even removed from the political spectrum. And on the right, we're seeing it manifest in this way related to these increasingly normalized ideas in our politics. On the left, it's having the impact of effectively splitting Jews off from the coalitions that we need to be a part of at a moment when all of our safety is under threat and our democracy is at risk.
So when we talk about Charlottesville, one of the things that is apparent to me is that a lot of people didn't understand that they were actually talking about Jews. They thought it was a protest about taking down Civil War monuments and the like, and then it morphed into Jews will not replace us, but it also feels like a lot of people have forgotten or never knew that that was sort of, I don't want to say it was the start of that sort of public display, but in some ways it was really the most jarring one. Tell us a little bit about how you took what you did with regards to Charlottesville and what brings you then here in your capacity at JCPA. What is that path?
Well, you're absolutely right that at the core of the Charlottesville violence is anti-Semitism. And during our trial, we actually had Deborah Lipstadt, who's now the special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, renowned Holocaust scholar, and anti-Semitism expert. She served as the expert witness in our case to help the jury, which, as you can imagine, from the Western District of Virginia, largely from outside of Charlottesville. I don't believe there was a single Jewish person on that jury. It was a very ideologically diverse jury, and for many of them probably at first didn't fully understand why Jews will not replace us, why anti-Semitism was so central to the rhetoric that we saw, not just during that horrific weekend in 2017, but frankly in the courtroom from the neo-Nazi defendants themselves who made Holocaust jokes on the stand and engaged in the very same anti-Semitic racist bigotry that they had brought to Charlottesville in 2017 in an attempt to desensitize the jury. And so we had to actually make the case as to what anti-Semitism is and how it operates in a way that threatens each and every community. And so when we talk about anti-Semitism and democracy, it's impossible to separate them because we saw that in Charlottesville, we see that in our work at JCPA, and that's sort of the path. We know that anti-Semitism functions as a form of religious, racial, ethnic bigotry. It's easy to understand it as that form of prejudice because that's how most bias and bigotry operate, most discrimination operate. But what's unique about anti-Semitism is that it also operates as sort of an insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory related to ideas of Jewish control and power. And in Charlottesville, we saw it in the form of Jews being this force orchestrating the replacement of white people. The belief that the white race was under threat because Jews were bringing black people into positions of power and immigrants into our country. And were seeking to wipe out white history in the form of taking down these Confederate monuments and erasing these ideas that these extremists hold. And so what that tells us is that anti-Semitism doesn't just simply threaten the Jewish community, although of course it does, in very real, increasingly violent ways. But it also threatens each and every one of us because this conspiracy theory serves to sow distrust in our democracy, sow distrust between communities, sow distrust in our institutions, and make people feel like they can't trust our government, they can't trust our political system, our election system, our media, our institutions, our financial institutions, because they're controlled by Jews, by this cabal. And so when we think about the work that we need to do for Jewish safety in this moment, and frankly for everyone's safety, you can't do any of it without taking on these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories at their core, whether it's in holding accountable the extremists in Charlottesville or the work we're now doing at JCPA, at the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which was founded 80 years ago in 1944 at a time when Jews here and around the world were obviously incredibly vulnerable, thinking about how we protect ourselves so that we don't go through what we had just seen our community go through. How do we build relationships between communities in a way that fundamentally protects and recognizes Jewish safety as deeply linked to others? And over the course of JCPA's history, it's been on the front lines, organizing the Jewish community during the Civil Rights Movement, helping found the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, helping lead the Jewish contingent at the original March on Washington, and really working hand in hand with JCRCs around the country, like the one here in Milwaukee, to build relationships between communities. Yes, because our Jewish values tell us that justice and repairing the world and all of those fundamental values are crucial, but also because we know Jewish safety is inextricably linked with inclusive, pluralistic societies, and taking on anti-Semitism and protecting Jewish safety is inextricably linked with advancing the safety and the rights of each and every other community and our democracy. And if we can't do both of those things, Jews won't be safe and no other community will be safe.
So I want to follow up on what we saw in Charlottesville was so blatant. I mean, they're literally shouting it. And I feel that what we're seeing more recently, and especially since October 7th, is rather than using sort of right and left, is sort of a more subtle attempt at the same rhetoric couched in more pleasant words, or maybe couched in social justice language but still trying to achieve the same result. Can you tell us a little bit about how we're seeing those changes in anti-Semitism?
Well, none of this started on October 7th, much like none of this started in Charlottesville or frankly with the election of Donald Trump or any of the markers people like to point to. This extremism, this hate, this anti-Semitism is as old as anything. We know that. I think the Jewish community knows that better than anyone. But what's happened, whether it be in the last 5.5 months since October 7th or in the last 6+ years since Charlottesville and the 2016 election, and the ways in which extremists have been emboldened, is that the Band-Aid has effectively been ripped off. And people are emboldened in new ways. And they're able to give voice and give license to a form of bigotry and to very specific anti-Semitism that, I think again, maybe 10 years ago would have been unheard of to many of us. And so what we're seeing now, post-October 7th, is a few different things. But first and foremost, the celebration of or denial of what happened on October 7th as one of the main manifestations of this. I think many of us remember the horror of October 7th. I remember vividly waking up to the news unfolding, to a slew of text messages that she got. I think it was Simchat Torah, and quickly getting on the phone with our board chair, getting out our statement, and really not quite recognizing just how extensive this actually was. And as the news became more and more clear, not just being horrified by what was coming out of Israel and the reports we were reading, but the fact that, I live in New York, I think the next day there were people in the street celebrating it in Times Square. There was a rally organized by DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, celebrating it, which I don't think was actually representative of the vast majority of any community, but certainly they were the loudest voices. And it was intended to make the Jewish community at a moment of deep pain and grief feel even more vulnerable and alone. And it was again intended to really split the Jewish community off, and those who care about Israel and support the right to a Jewish homeland to be removed and separated from the very sort of progressive or liberal coalitions we need to be building to take on extremism and the threats to our democracy. And seeing that unfold, and of course the ways in which that has continued in different forms over the last 5.5 months is not just heartbreaking, but also deeply dangerous.
So one of the things that JCRC has been doing for many years here in Milwaukee is making those coalitions, being present in all different kinds of spaces with members of our community. And I think one of the most challenging things that's happened, and I will use 10/7 as a marker, is all of that work, all of those relationships, feeling like so many of them have crumbled to dust. And that feeling of betrayal, really, from people that we thought were friends, colleagues, associates, people that we were in coalition with. Are you seeing that outside of, throughout this country, or?
I might push back on that a little bit, because I think it's easy to feel that way, and certainly we have every right to feel deep pain and grief and betrayal from a number of spaces and voices that we thought would say something or would speak out. But also for every terrible statement or quiet elected official, there have been at least as many, if not more, allies who have spoken out in some form. I think about some of the first calls I got from the Black civil rights leader, from other key folks I've worked with over the years, who were on the phone with me on October 8th and October 9th, not because they necessarily wanted to talk about what comes next in terms of Israel and Gaza policy, or because we're going to agree on every piece of the conflict, but because they just saw what happened as the deadliest day for the Jewish community since the Holocaust and wanted to express their sympathy. Simple as that, and say that they had my back, they saw my pain, and that if I wanted to talk, or as the inevitable wave of anti-Semitism, and of course also Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate that came after October 7th unfolded, we knew that we would need to be mobilizing together to fight hate here at home, even as we were grappling with the horrific fallout and continued trauma of what still happens is happening 5.5 months later in Israel and Gaza. And so it's, I think it's more complicated than it sometimes seems, because the loudest voices on social media, the loudest voices protesting on our streets, screaming outside the city or county councils and commissions, are not the ones who are necessarily representative of the vast majority of people, but they're the ones that we hear most often. The social media algorithms fuel this and make us feel alone. The voices that are spending all of their energy advocating for local governments or elected officials to weigh in on foreign policy, while at the end of the day, the vast majority of people, the vast majority of Americans certainly hold the complexity of this, believe that Israel has a right to exist, believe that anti-Semitism is a real threat, might not agree with everything that the Israeli government does, might have deep concerns over the situation in Gaza, but can actually hold that complexity, even if that complexity is not represented in the sort of black and white zero-sum screaming wars that so often dominate the conflict. But what that zero-sum framework, what the false binaries of this debate so often have the intent, or rather have the impact of, is making us as Jews feel alone and isolated, as if there is no one in coalition with us, as if we are all alone, and those loud voices screaming, whether it's in Times Square on October 8th or in any of the other capacities since, are representative of the majority of people. And I think in particular when it comes to sort of coalition and bridge building work that's at the core of what we do at JCPA and what the JCRCs around the country are doing, for every horrible statement or bad protest we've seen in a community, there's been 7 or 10 or 15 fires that haven't happened because of those relationships that have been in place, because of the hard, challenging, and long-standing work of community relations that JCRCs and others in the community have been doing. And so it's harder to quantify that. It's harder to say, we're not alone, and all of these people didn't put out bad statements, and therefore, how do we tally that up in the same way that you can easily tally up the painful statements, the trolls you're getting on social media, the friends who posted something insensitive at best and deeply bigoted at worst. But it's important that I think we step back and understand that, because the goal of these extremists is to make us feel alone. And there are so many people who are doubling down on that right now, whether it be from the left or the right, or sort of removed from the ideological spectrum. There are many who stand to benefit by making us feel isolated and powerless and alone, and we can't let them.
So you touched on how we're seeing October 7th denialism, which certainly feels like it has a parallel to Holocaust denialism, which had quite the heyday 10, 15 years ago, the whole Deborah Lipstadt trial and all of that. But that sort of social media and vocalizing of that can feel very alienating. How do we navigate that sort of conspiracy theory, that overwhelming feeling that our voices are being lost, while at the same time maintaining our own sanity and our own coalition together with each other?
Part of what we need to do as a community, both in our community and with our allies and our partners and our friends, is some level setting about what does allyship actually look like in this moment. Who are reachable? Who should we be trying to reach? And who should we, for our own sanity, to your point, maybe leave to the side for now? And this is really at the core of the work that we do at JCPA, and I know the JCRCs are thinking about. And so the people who are, frankly, I think a small minority, but quite loud, who are going to deny what happened on October 7th or celebrate what happened on October 7th, are doing that as a way to sort of troll us, for lack of a better term, to get a rise out of us, to have us debating on their turf, which is, did this happen or not? As opposed to, how do we actually fight anti-Semitism in this moment? How do we protect Israel's right to exist? How do we move forward and find a path that recognizes the future Israelis and Palestinians need, and Jews and Muslims and Arabs here in the United States? And so it's important that I think we not sort of fall prey to the turf they want us debating on and let this turn into a conversation of did this happen or did this not happen? And rather really focus our energies on the allies, the potential allies and the partners and others who are in that movable middle and who are open to having constructive conversations. And what we can do as a Jewish community is to recognize that there's nuance and complexity there. There are absolutely those who are malicious, who are seeking to exploit what happened, to deny it, to celebrate it, to use it to perpetuate anti-Semitism. But there's also a lot of either ignorance or confusion or complexity, or even just policy disagreements, and how we can look at that and say, you know, these folks who are seeking to exploit this, to spread lies, to spread hate, are over there, but for the vast majority of people, we might not agree with them on everything. They might not be hanging an Israeli flag outside their house. They might not be supporting every action of the Israeli government. They might have deep concerns about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But they can still see the humanity of the Israeli people, and they can still see the pain and the grief of the Jewish people here. And how do you find those people and engage them in a way that actually holds that complexity and doesn't dismiss it, and recognize that even in this room of a couple hundred people, there's probably a couple hundred different views on exactly how we find a path forward in Israel and Gaza. And we can embrace that complexity and have those conversations both within our community and create the sort of broad tent Jewish community we need, and also stay at the table with our allies and our potential partners however and wherever possible, while still having those red lines on the people who celebrate or deny what happened on October 7th, or very much intentionally using it to make Jews less safe.
200 people, 400 opinions.
Exactly.
So the topic of today's conversation, or tonight's conversation, has been about, is the intersection of anti-Semitism and democracy. And as somebody who's very active in elections work, and someone who's been active through the JCRC for many years in anti-Semitism work, it had never occurred to me to put those two things together. They didn't seem to go. And yet, when we spoke the other day, you gave me some really good examples of why I'm completely wrong, and that these things are absolutely inextricably intertwined. And I'd like you to share with us why.
So, and we talked earlier about how anti-Semitism operates not just as a form of bigotry and prejudice in the way we all know, but really as this conspiracy theory. And we're seeing that right now play out in ways in which this conspiracy theory is used to directly undercut our democratic institutions, our systems, our trust in democracy at its core. So whether it is this idea that there is an effort to replace not just white people, but so often we see sort of watered down but equally dangerous versions of it, about a democratic effort to replace the electorate by bringing up people from the southern border, or supporting Black and brown communities in different ways, and making sure anyone, undocumented immigrants, can vote. All of the different conspiracy theories that we so often hear. If you peel back the layers in them, so many of them are fundamentally rooted in these conspiracy theories. You oftentimes hear words like George Soros used as a stand-in for Jews. You hear about a globalist effort or a cabal.
Rothschilds.
Exactly. Sometimes you even hear the word Rothschild still in the year 2024. And some of it comes directly from the protocols of the elders of Zion in a way that is truly both baffling and almost like you almost have to laugh at some of it, but it's so dangerous that you can't. And so we have to understand how these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are used to not just advance specific policies, whether it's on the voting rights front, or the immigrant rights front, or the LGBTQ rights front, or the reproductive freedom front, right? We're seeing how all of these conspiracy theories are effectively intertwined. We talked about how it relates to voting rights, but we're seeing, of course, on immigration, very similar rhetoric, the idea of there being a deliberate invasion or replacement. In fact, the Jewish cabinet secretary, the Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, who's been a remarkable ally, not even ally because he's Jewish himself, but remarkable partner of the Jewish community, particularly since October 7th, was just impeached by the House for using language like invasion and replacement, claiming that he, this Jewish cabinet secretary, was responsible for an invasion of our southern border. This impeachment's not going anywhere, but the fact that it happened is deeply disturbing. And similarly, we're seeing neo-Nazis mobilize outside anti-LGBTQ events, outside drag shows, against the trans community with swastikas. We're seeing conspiracy theories about birth rates being used to take on reproductive freedom. And all of these, at their core, are fundamentally rooted in the same idea that there is some conspiracy theory, some cabal, some effort to undercut our institutions and to effectively change the demographics, the values of this country in a way that always comes back to the Jews. And so if we don't take on anti-Semitism, we don't take on the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories at their core, every one of these other communities and our fundamental democracy and values are at stake. And I would say the flip side of that is that if we are not building inclusive, pluralistic, democratic societies, which we first and foremost know are where Jews have always been safest throughout our history, but also we are laying the fertile ground for these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories to continue to be weaponized against us and against so many other communities. So it's a two-way street in which we need to be taking on anti-Semitism, not just to take on these dehumanizing and deeply dangerous anti-democratic policies, but we also need to be protecting and advancing democracy to protect and advance Jewish safety.
So one thing that we're seeing is that there's a big generational divide in how older Jews see what's going on and how our children, our young people see the same things we're seeing with a completely different lens. And how do we open dialogue within our own community, with our own young people, to talk about what we see going on in the lens of anti-Semitism that they may be dismissing as no big deal, or what are you talking about, and that sort of youthful lack, perhaps, of the depth of knowledge that you're talking about?
Well, I think you're right that it needs to start in our own community. And I think in particular the ways in which the Israel conversation happens is dramatically different on a generational basis. I'm probably among the youngest American Jews that, like, really, my formative experience with Israel was during the Second Intifada, a time when buses and pizza shops and other places were being blown up in Israel. And I went to live in Israel a few years after and was told by my mother, don't get on a bus, don't you dare get on a bus. I mean, I still got on the bus and I was fine. But that was a very formative piece of my connection and my understanding of Israel. Younger American Jews and younger Americans in general have never seen an Israel that is under threat, except for, of course, October 7th. And I would add that for them, the only prime minister they've ever really known is Bibi Netanyahu. And however you feel about him, I think he is quite the polarizing figure among American Jews in general, and certainly among younger American Jews. And so first understanding that context and thinking about the perspective from which they are understanding Israel and understanding the debate that's happening, certainly since October 7th, but long before that as well. And then how we actually enter those conversations in a way that not just recognizes that, but tries to keep the broadest possible tent. There are definitely red lines. There are so often efforts to lift up sort of fringe groups and claim that they speak on behalf of the Jewish community, whether it's some of the stuff that GDP or DSA or any of these other groups have been doing. But for the vast majority of Jewish Americans of all ages, but particularly on their side, holding the complexity of being able to criticize Israel, to disagree with its government, to have deep horror and concern over the humanitarian situation in Gaza, while still believing Israel has a fundamental right to exist, still believing that the hostages need to be released, still being deeply heartbroken and still currently in deep trauma over what happened on October 7th and its continued aftermath. We need to be able to hold all of those things. And I'm even thinking about the conversation happening this week in the Jewish community around Senator Schumer, my senator, who was my high school graduation speaker. There's no one who has been more pro-Israel in his entire career. He gave a speech last week on the Senate floor that good people can disagree over the details of. Should he have called for elections in Israel? Should he have necessarily done this, that, or the other thing? We can all have disagreements over that. But there are some who are now trying to say that Senator Chuck Schumer, of all people, the senior most Jewish elected official in this country, is now outside the pro-Israel tent, that he's enabling detractors of Israel. If Chuck Schumer is outside the pro-Israel tent, almost none of us are in the pro-Israel tent. And we need to understand that there's deep complexity that our community holds on this, that particularly the youngest Jews hold on this, and frankly all Americans hold on this. And that is how we're going to be able to have the conversations that help them understand you can believe all of these things to be true at the same time and be concerned for Palestinian humanity and dignity and be opposed to the Netanyahu government while still fundamentally believing Israel has a right to exist and Israelis are worthy of dignity and humanity as well.
So you've mentioned DSA several times. Here in Milwaukee, we're in the midst of a controversy over a statement proposed by a DSA representative to both the he has a dual role, state legislature and the county board. And that statement doesn't mention Hamas, doesn't mention October 7th. It's like something just happened. It was a miracle. I don't know. There's no mention of the return of the hostages in the statement, and it's created really a lot of feelings among so many people. And that's going to be coming up for a vote on Thursday. They are not taking public testimony, so just letting you all know that. But I'm interested in hearing from you. This is not the first attempt at something like this. This isn't the first whitewashing of October 7th that I'm sure is happening across the country. What have you seen, and have there been some, what you might term, successes in addressing those sort of statements?
The good news is yes. It's not all terrible. And I want to make sure that when we all leave this room, we recognize that there are actually reasons for hope. And for me, some of what's been happening on these ceasefire resolutions actually gives me reason for hope. Not all of them. And as you can imagine, in communities around the country, in California and there in the Midwest, in Boston, wherever, Chicago, there have been a variety of different resolutions related to October 7th and its aftermath. And some of them have been awful, some of them have been less awful, and some of them have actually been pretty good. And I mean, I should say the listserv of JCRC professionals has been by far the most pervasive topic, because communities of all different sizes and localities are grappling with this. And so what's happening here, you are not alone, and the fact that it took maybe 5.5 months to happen is, I don't know, a good sign. I don't know if it's a good sign or not, but
well, it was introduced in January, so well, it's taken a while.
Fair enough. But the good news is that there have been a number of cases through, again, the hard work of JCRCs and other Jewish communal professionals, and frankly, I think deep relationships that have existed long before October 7th with elected officials, with partner organizations, with government officials, that have resulted in outcomes that are better than where they started. Whether it be resolutions that started in that one-sided way, and while we might not agree with every word of them, while they might call for a ceasefire in some form, fundamentally recognize the humanity of the Israeli people, the horrors of October 7th, call for the release of the hostages, and also, frankly, focus on what local and state governments should be focused on instead of foreign policy, which is the ripple effects here at home, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate that's been unleashed in the aftermath. And so we've seen that, and including in places like California, places like San Jose, where they had a resolution proposed, and in fact, after feedback from the local community, turned it into a statement that was actually quite good. Or, I think in particular, I think about, both my parents are retired public school teachers. They're both members of the teachers union. And we have been working with AFT, with the American Federation of Teachers, which is the national teachers union, which has been navigating this, as you can imagine, in a deeply, deeply polarized world. Randy Weinberger, who leads AFT, I think has really been navigating this in a phenomenal way. She and her wife Sharon, who's a rabbi, who went to Israel in the immediate aftermath of October 7th and what they called a Shiva visit. spending time with their colleagues and friends and family there, with labor unions and others there who were grappling with the aftermath. And as you can imagine, there were some who were not so thrilled about that. And many who have been pressuring her and the union to put forward a ceasefire resolution. Ultimately, at the end of January, they reached consensus on a resolution that I think is a remarkable model. It calls for a bilateral negotiated ceasefire, accepted by both sides, by Hamas and Israel, which I think is something that hypothetically all of us would want, if it's possible. It calls for the release of the hostages. It calls for, it acknowledges October 7th as the deadliest day for the Jews since the Holocaust. It also calls for increased humanitarian aid to Gaza and laments the humanitarian situation there. And most importantly, it really focuses on the ripple effects here at home and what educators can do to stand up against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab hate, which is where they actually have the most impact. And so I'm sharing this not because I agree with every word of this resolution or because I think it was perfect, but because it gives me hope that even in a progressive union, there was a way to actually get to a place that the vast majority of members have been not just okay with, but actually pretty proud of. And I'm headed to DC tomorrow to do a program with AFT on how we continue to have these constructive conversations in this moment, how we sit down with people we fundamentally disagree with on issues like Israel and Gaza and still find the places where we can work together to fight hate and extremism and advance democracy here at home. And so, there's a lot of reasons to feel depressed and hopeless in this moment, but for me, I think ironically, some of the processes around these resolutions have actually given me some hope that good things can come out of it and that we can sort of move past these sort of sometimes performative political things into the hard conversations that we need to be having.
So now I want to know, what did that process look like? What does a successful process look like, and how can we as a community bring that into our own I doubt this is going to be the only resolution. I suspect we'll see more. What can we learn from what you saw on how to maybe take something that's terrible into something, I don't have great aspirations, less bad?
Yeah. Less bad is always better than the alternative.
Less bad is always better.
We will take our wins where we can get them these days. I'll say a few things. I think first and foremost, our instincts right now are to walk away from the table, right? We are so hurt. We're in such pain. We're in such grief. And for many of us, we're feeling like we showed up in some of these coalitions in these spaces for so long, and we feel abandoned over the last 5.5 months. And that's true in certain spaces. It's perhaps an oversimplification, as we were talking about earlier. And I think for me, the aftermath of October 7th, the pain and the grief, and whether it be the increase in these resolutions or the comments or lack thereof from people who we thought were our partners and allies, for me, instead of proof of failure of community relations and bridge building, for me it's proof of need. That we need to be leaning into these relationships, leaning into these conversations as hard as they might be, staying at the table with elected officials with whom we disagree, with community partners with whom we disagree, because that's actually how we change those resolutions. That's how we have the relationship so that they hear us when we say something about this isn't right and it's causing harm to our community. And at the end of the day, as we've been talking about, despite the many people trying to divide us, all of our safety is deeply intertwined. And if we are not advancing the sorts of inclusive democracy and fundamental civil rights and racial justice and social justice we know is inherent not just to all community safety, but specifically the Jewish community safety, as we've been talking about, none of us are going to be safe. So I think we need to reject those instincts in this moment to walk away from the table, as painful as it might be. There are some tables we are going to walk away from, but the vast majority of them are ones where we really need to lean into these conversations as hard as they might be. And that's how you get to the place with these elected officials, with others who, some of them might just be operating from a place of maliciousness, as we talked about, or from bigotry. And understanding that and then being able to call that out is important. But for the vast majority of people, helping them understand why October 7th was so painful to the Jewish community, the intergenerational trauma it triggered in so many of us, seeing Jews pulled from their homes and kidnapped and sexually assaulted, raped, and murdered. That is something that triggered, I think, the worst possible trauma all of us hold as Jews. and explaining that to people, having the relationships to be able to explain that to them. The fact that there are still hostages being held 5.5 months later means that that trauma is ongoing, it hasn't ended. And the fact that the vast majority of American Jews have a deep personal connection to Israel and believe in its fundamental right to exist, even again if they don't agree with every action of the government or hold the complexity of the conflict. And so being able to actually explain that to people so that they can in turn, through resolutions or otherwise, hopefully reflect some of that nuance is where we've actually seen the progress, where we've either seen resolutions not move forward in certain cases or been updated and adapted to actually reflect the deep pain and the grief our own community is feeling, which doesn't dismiss everything that people from, whether it be the Palestinian or Arab American community, the Muslim American community, or other parts of our communities who are advocating for some of these resolutions, it doesn't dismiss some of the very real concerns they're raising about the situation in Gaza and Palestinian lives and the ripple effects here at home as well. But being able to help people hold all of that is something that we can uniquely do because it's our lived experiences, Jews, and only we can really share that from the personal perspective. And so we have to reject those worst instincts to walk away from those relationships and the table, as painful as it might be.
So one area that I think has a real area of commonality, tying us back into the questions of democracy and anti-Semitism, is the ability to vote and voting rights. And, you know, here in Wisconsin, we've had all sorts of attacks on our ability to vote. We can't use drop boxes anymore. Our early voting went from 30 days to 2 weeks and only 1 weekend because it was targeted against souls to the polls, the African American push to bring people from church to voting. So they wanted to eliminate that. 1 weekend was restored. There's commonality there. Is there a way to use that shared interest to sort of make these connections or continue these connections that you're talking about?
Well, that's precisely what we're doing at JCPA, and I suspect what JCRC and many others are going to be continuing to build here. One, because again, we know that even if our voting rights are not under attack specifically, even though they are often also under attack with some of these laws and proposals, an attack on any community's fundamental rights fundamentally undercuts our own safety as well, in addition to our values. And so we at JCPA are launching 2 action networks in the next couple of weeks. These action networks specifically bring together national and local Jewish and non-Jewish partners, including a number of national Jewish organizations that I'm sure you all know well, and non-Jewish partners like the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights and others that have been core partners of ours in the fight for voting rights, for democracy, for so many other civil rights. And specifically working with JCRCs and other local partners around the country, helping to help make people understand how deeply connected these issues are for the reasons we talked about earlier, the ways in which, for example, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are fundamental to the advancement of so many of these policies you're describing, the broader dehumanizing and anti-democratic policies we're seeing proliferating around the country, and then mobilizing together because we know that not just rejecting those bad policies, but actually advancing good policies like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act that was just reintroduced in the Senate in Washington that we are supportive of, and so many others, are fundamental, again, to our safety and to our democracy right now. And it's hard, right? It's hard in a moment when we ourselves as a community are feeling like we're alone and we're isolated and we just want to sort of go into our corner and be with our pain and our grief, and that's okay. But at the end of the day, we have to resist those instincts and continue to lean into this work because we know it's inherent to our safety as well. I'm thinking, last summer I was very fortunate to go on a trip to Germany as part of a program called Widen the Circle that brings civil rights leaders from the United States who work on fighting hate and extremism and use history and remembrance to do so. And so for me, it was remarkable on many levels. Despite being the granddaughter of survivors, I'd never really been in that part of the world. My grandparents was in Poland, now Ukraine. I'd never been to Germany, I'd never been to a concentration camp. And that alone was deeply powerful. And on my trip was someone who is now a friend, Evan Milligan, who was the lead plaintiff in the case, the voting rights case that went before the Supreme Court last summer related to the redistricting in Alabama. The redistricting that specifically sought to marginalize and reduce the Black population's franchise, like to disenfranchise the Black population. And we were sitting in an East Berlin church where MLK had once preached when Evan's face sort of goes white, and he had just gotten a text that he had won his Supreme Court case. And we were sitting there, like literally learning about how fascism operates and how rights were being stripped away in the 20s and 30s in Germany, and how so much of that ultimately led to the dehumanization of all different communities that we were there to really dive into. And to have that moment of hope and to see, and to sit there with Evan, who is not Jewish, a Black man from Montgomery, Alabama, and fundamentally saw how his rights and my rights as a Jewish woman and the long sort of history of all of these intersecting attacks on our humanity were interconnected, and to have that win while we were there, it's like something that will stick with me forever. And of course, the aftermath of that Supreme Court case has continued, and there are various efforts to try to undercut the Supreme Court's decision. And I think the side of civil rights has continued to largely win, which is good for us. And the fact that our court systems, as challenging as it might be, is still delivering some hope and some wins in certain ways gives me hope. But even more so than that, the ways in which, like that moment and seeing Evan win that case and understanding how fundamentally interconnected it was with the broader fight against extremism and for democracy that we were there sitting is like something that will live with me forever, and again gives me that hope in this moment.
And since I have a microphone, I want to remind everyone that early voting has started here in the state of Wisconsin. And if you don't know whether you are registered to vote or want to investigate where you go to early vote, go to myvote.wi.gov. So, and thank you for that public service announcement.
Thank you. And for all you do to protect the right to vote.
Absolutely. So as we conclude tonight, you just gave us sort of that feeling you had of hope. And even though you're watching it because it's so fragile, what should we be taking away that may make, I'm always worried in events like this that people are going to leave this room and be like, oh my God, it's terrible. and I don't want that to be the note we leave on, because I don't think that is the note that we should be leaving on tonight, because I think while we struggle, there is an end that we can be aspiring to and that is available to us. What is that note that you can give us?
I think there's a lot of reasons to feel scared and hopeless right now, but there's also a lot of reasons to not. For me, certainly the story I just told is one that I think about, but I also think a lot about our Charlottesville trial and how for 4 weeks we sat in that courtroom as the neo-Nazi defendants, many of whom were representing themselves, or at least a few of whom were representing themselves, used every tactic to try to desensitize the jury to their hate. Holocaust jokes, explicit anti-Semitism, racism, using the N-word, making the jury feel as if this hate was just so normal. How could they possibly have been doing something worthy of being found liable? And in fact, one of the defense attorneys actually told the media after the case this was a very deliberate tactic, that they were seeking to desensitize the jury. And of course, we know right now there are so many of the loudest voices who are seeking to desensitize people to hate, whether it be on the right or the left, in different forms, as we've been talking about this evening. But the good news is that that jury didn't bite. They found every single defendant liable, because even in a moment when you're steeped in that dehumanizing, horrific rhetoric, people are still fundamentally able to differentiate between good and bad. And even at this moment when it feels like the loudest voices all around us are telling us that we as Jews are alone and that everyone can't see the pain and the horror of October 7th and that anti-Semitism is inevitable and pervasive, you actually look at where the vast majority of Americans are, they still believe that anti-Semitism is a very real threat that we need to address, that it's a fundamental concern to our democracy and to their own safety. And in fact, research that we just wrapped up tells us that, especially among 18 to 34-year-olds, the path to help people understand why anti-Semitism matters to them is to help them actually see how hate begets hate and how the fight against anti-Semitism is a fight for their own safety and for our democracy. And so for me, that gives me hope, because it tells us that if people, despite those loudest voices, despite those efforts to desensitize them to hate and to bigotry and to extremism, they are still able to fundamentally see how Jewish safety is deeply connected to their own safety and to our democracy, and how all of our futures are inextricably linked at a time when so many are trying to divide our communities and telling us that we can't be in relationship together, sit at the tables together, be neighbors. And so I think for me that gives me a lot of hope. We have to work really, really hard to keep building those relationships and not let those loudest voices pervade the entire conversation. But where we do that, where we invest in our relationships with our elected officials and our neighbors, and we stay at the table for those hard conversations, and we don't let those loudest voices dominate the conversation, but rather live in the complexity of nuance of this moment, we're able to actually fundamentally protect the humanity and dignity of our community and so many others.
Amy, this has been just terrific. Thank you so much for coming to Milwaukee and sharing this with us.
Thank you, Amy and Anne, for such an thoughtful and insightful discussion. Can we give them another round of applause? I don't know about you, but my mind has been blown. The two of you are very inspirational as the Director of Women's Philanthropy. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You've delivered to each of us the knowledge and empowerment of Edie Adelman, what she envisioned when she endowed this lecture, so thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm Deb Carneal-Fendrick, Director of Women's Philanthropy. So before we wrap up, I want to do a couple thank yous. Thank you to Sharon Grinker, Jill Plavnick, Carrie Steinberger, and Andy Zimmerman. You are the reason this program happened. Your passion for building connections and enabling responsible citizens to live out Jewish values help make tonight truly outstanding and an educational experience. So thank you. I also would like to thank Joan Lubar, our board chair, for being here fresh off a powerful mission to Israel that witnessed the atrocities of October 7th. Thank you for your remarks and how you help us do our work every day. I also want to thank Tanya Arbit, Women's Philanthropy's chair, for the same. She just also returned from that very powerful trip, and for helping plan tonight's event. I also would like to recognize that we have Milwaukee Jewish Federation's future board chair, Judy Corin, in the room, MJF's current campaign chair, Susan Angel Miller, and Milwaukee Jewish Federation's president and CEO, Miriam Rosenzweig. All of them are in the room today. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your support of tonight's event. Oh, and all you do for our community. I also would like to acknowledge that we have a special guest in the room. Edie's son, Judge Lynn Adelman, is with us this evening. So I want to say thank you to your mother, to your entire family for her vision and passion to make sure events like this are possible within our community. So thank you for being here. Thank you for having that vision. We cannot do this without families like you, so thank you. As was mentioned earlier, we hope that you will read the 2023 audit of anti-Semitic incidents when it is published. I realize that this information will be tough to digest, but it is important information to equip ourselves within the face of public discourse. You can access the 2022 audit and soon the 2023 audit, as well as other resources I believe Anne's public service announcement is a part of the resources as well, by scanning the QR code that you can find in your program, or by going to milwaukeejewish.org/Edie. Thank you again for being a part of this year's Edie Adelman Political Awareness Lecture. I hope you are leaving tonight, as I am, even more inspired to make a difference in our local and global communities. Good night.